Before we get started, make sure to subscribe to the channel and like this video. That way, you'll always stay connected to our stories and never miss the next adventure. Galactic summits, as it turned out, were exactly as boring as Sia had imagined, only with worse food and better views. She stood in the observation deck of Helix Prime, an orbital station that looked like someone had taken a spiral staircase, stretched it into space, and decided to hang a conference center off it. Outside the viewport, a gas giant swirled in shades of purple and gold, its rings cutting across the darkness like nature's own jewelry display. Beautiful, sure. But Sia had been staring at metal samples for the past 3 days, and honestly, the novelty of space had worn off somewhere around hour 2 of the flight up. The Intergalactic Materials Summit was supposed to be prestigious. Cutting edge, a gathering of the galaxy's finest minds in metallurgy, polymer science, and exotic matter manipulation. Representatives from dozens of worlds, all here to show off their latest breakthroughs and pretend they weren't trying to steal each other's research. Sia was only here because of a clerical error. See, she'd submitted a grant proposal on experimental alloy composites, something small, modest, the kind of thing that might get you a polite rejection letter and a coupon for 10% off next year's application fee. Except somewhere in the bureaucratic nightmare that was the Galactic Science Foundation, someone had clicked Approve instead of Archive. By the time anyone noticed, she already had the travel vouchers and a hotel room reservation on an orbital station 300,000 kilometers from Earth. She'd meant to come clean, really, but then she'd seen the stipend amount, and, well, morality was flexible when you were a graduate student living on ramen and spite. Now she was here, wearing her one good blazer, eating complimentary space shrimp from a buffet table that seemed to replenish itself through what she assumed was either very advanced technology or very tiny robots. The shrimp was good, at least. Tasted like shrimp, but with a faint electric tingle that made her tongue feel like it was getting a gentle massage. Around her, the summit buzzed with activity. Delegates clustered in groups, their translators chirping and humming as they converted dozens of languages into something resembling mutual understanding. She'd spotted at least 5 species she couldn't name, including something that looked like a very formal jellyfish, in a suit, and a rock creature that may or may not have been wearing pants. It was hard to tell. But the crowd's attention, all of it, was focused on the presentation stage at the far end of the hall. The Draymore had arrived. Sia had heard about the Draymore, of course. Everyone had. They were the galaxy's unofficial, well, let's be honest, official, masters of metalwork. Their civilization had been forging legendary weapons and tools for thousands of years before humanity figured out bronze. Their works were in museums, private collections, royal armories on 100 worlds. Draymore steel was a benchmark, a standard, the thing every metallurgist measured themselves against and usually found themselves wanting. They were also, from what Sia could tell, absolutely insufferable about it. The Draymore delegation occupied the center of the hall like they owned it, which, given that they'd probably funded half the station's construction, they might as well have. There were 6 of them, each standing nearly 8 feet tall, their bodies covered in chitinous plates that ranged from deep crimson to burnished gold. 4 arms apiece, each ending in 3-fingered hands that looked delicate, until you remembered they could bend steel bars like pipe cleaners. At the center of the group stood Forge Master Rilmoth. Even among Draymore, he was impressive. His carapace was the color of old bronze, etched with patterns that Sia assumed were either decorative or some kind of rank insignia, possibly both. His upper arms were crossed over his chest in a pose of casual superiority, while his lower hands rested on what looked like a ceremonial hammer at his belt. His head was angular, almost avian, with 4 eyes arranged in a diamond pattern that gave him an unsettling 360-degree awareness. He was speaking, his voice a deep thrumming that the translators rendered into smooth, confident English. And so we present the culmination of 15 generations of research, refinement, and dedication to the craft. Rilmoth gestured with one hand, and a holographic display materialized above the stage. It showed a blade, long and curved, its surface gleaming with an inner light. "Behold, singing steel!" The crowd leaned forward. Even Sia, lurking near the back with her plate of shrimp, found herself paying attention. "This metal," Rilmoth continued, his voice taking on the practiced rhythm of someone who had given this speech before and knew exactly where the applause lines were, "resonates at a molecular frequency that generates harmonic vibrations. When properly attuned, these vibrations allow the blade to cut through materials far harder than itself. Starship hulls, reinforced composites, even energy shielding, all yield before singing steel." He paused, letting the weight of that statement settle over the audience. Furthermore, the forging process requires temperatures exceeding 6,000 degrees, maintained within a tolerance of 0.03%, for a period of no less than 18 hours. The slightest deviation results in catastrophic structural failure. In the 3,000-year history of Dremor metallurgy, only 38 forge masters have successfully created singing steel. I am the 39th. Applause erupted through the hall. Delegates chittered, hummed, and made whatever noises their species used to express admiration. The jellyfish thing pulsed with bioluminescent approval. Sia ate another shrimp and tried not to roll her eyes. Look, she wasn't saying it wasn't impressive. It was. Singing steel was legitimately incredible. The harmonic resonance alone represented principles that human metallurgy was only beginning to explore. But there was something about Rilmoth's presentation, that self-satisfied tone, the way he stood there soaking in the adoration like a very large, very smug lizard. "Fancy but brittle," she muttered, reaching for another shrimp. The hall went quiet. Very, very quiet. Sia's hand froze halfway to the buffet table. Oh no. Oh no, no, no. She knew that kind of quiet. That was the "everyone just heard what you said" kind of quiet. She turned slowly, and yes, every eye, compound eye, optical sensor, and psychic perception organ in the room was pointed at her. Rilmoth's 4 eyes fixed on her position with the precision of targeting lasers. He took a step forward, his lower hands uncrossing as he peered toward the back of the hall. "I apologize," he said, his voice carrying a dangerous edge beneath the politeness. "Did someone wish to offer commentary on my presentation?" Sia considered several options, pretending she hadn't spoken, blaming it on the jellyfish, faking a medical emergency, and fleeing to the nearest escape pod. Instead, because her brain and mouth had apparently signed a mutual non-interference treaty, she heard herself say, "I said it's fancy but brittle. Singing steel. All that molecular resonance probably compromises the structural lattice. Makes it great for cutting, sure, but I'd bet my degree it shatters if you hit it with a good shock load." The silence somehow got quieter. Rilmoth moved through the crowd, which parted before him like water. Within seconds, he was standing in front of Sia, all 8 feet and 4 arms of him, looking down at her like a professor who'd just caught a student sleeping in class. "Your degree," he said slowly. "And what manner of degree might that be? What credentials do you possess to critique Dremor craftsmanship?" Sia's survival instinct finally kicked in, screaming at her to apologize, to backpedal, to maybe just pass out and let future Sia deal with this mess. But she'd already committed. Might as well ride it into the ground. Metallurgy, graduate level. And I'm not critiquing Draymore craftsmanship. I'm just saying there's always trade-offs. You optimize for one property, you compromise others. It's basic materials science. One of Rilmoth's eyes twitched, just slightly. Basic, materials, science. Yeah, I see. The Forge Master's mandibles clicked together in what Sia desperately hoped wasn't the Draymore equivalent of a smile. Tell me, young human, if your species' metallurgy is so enlightened, so advanced, what have your people created that surpasses Draymore work? And there it was. The trap, sprung neat and clean. Sia opened her mouth, closed it, tried to think of literally anything humanity had forged that could compare to singing steel, to Draymore legendary weapons, to 3,000 years of metallurgical mastery. She came up empty. The crowd was watching with the kind of fascination usually reserved for traffic accidents and reality television. She could feel their attention like a physical weight. Even the delegates who'd been ignoring the summit entirely were now paying attention, translators working overtime to make sure they didn't miss a single word of this beautiful, terrible disaster. Sia started. Rilmoth waited, his 4 eyes unblinking. We have, She was going to die here. Not literally, probably, but professionally. They'd revoke her credentials, such as they were. Send her back to Earth with a note stapled to her forehead. This one talks too much. And then, from somewhere in the desperate corners of her brain, a memory surfaced. Uncle Oswald's garage. The smell of coal smoke and grinding wheels. The knife he'd given her last birthday, its blade rippling with patterns like water frozen in steel. Damascus, she said. Rilmoth's head tilted. I am unfamiliar with this term. Damascus steel. Pattern-welded blades. My uncle makes them. In his garage, on weekends. The Forge Master regarded her for a long moment. Then he made a sound that the translator rendered as laughter, though it sounded more like rocks grinding together in a cement mixer. Your uncle makes them? On weekends? Yeah. I propose a challenge, Rilmoth said, his voice rising so the entire hall could hear. Since humanity's metallurgy is clearly so impressive that it can be practiced recreationally by relatives, let us put it to the test. You, young human, will create a blade using your weekend hobby steel. I will judge it against Draymore standards. When it fails, as it inevitably will, perhaps you will learn the value of humility. The crowd murmured with excitement. This was better than the scheduled presentations. This was drama. Sia felt sweat forming on her palms. And if it doesn't fail? Rilmoth's mandibles spread in what was definitely a smile this time. Not a nice one. Then I will personally deliver to your uncle my apologies and acknowledgement of his superior skill. But this will not happen, young human. The Draymore do not lose challenges of craft. He extended one lower hand. Do we have an accord? Sia looked at the hand, looked at the crowd, looked at the very deep hole she'd dug for herself, and decided, what the hell? Might as well keep digging and see if she hit magma. She shook his hand. His grip could have crushed stone. 1 month, Rilmoth declared. Return in 1 month with your blade, and we shall see if human weekend hobbies can stand against Draymore mastery. The crowd erupted in excited chatter as Rilmoth returned to his delegation, looking pleased with himself. Sia stood alone near the buffet table, still holding a plate of space shrimp, and slowly realized what she'd just agreed to. Well, she said to no one in particular, I am so incredibly fired. The jellyfish delegate pulsed sympathetically nearby. Millbrook, Oregon didn't know it was about to become the center of intergalactic attention, and frankly, it wouldn't have cared if it did. The town consisted of one main street, two diners that served identical coffee, a hardware store that somehow stayed in business despite selling nothing anyone actually needed, and about 800 people who preferred it that way. It was the kind of place where everyone knew everyone, where gossip traveled faster than light-speed communications, and where a strange car in someone's driveway was a topic of conversation for weeks. Sia pulled up to Uncle Oswald's house on a Wednesday morning, her rental car making suspicious noises that suggested it was held together by optimism and paperwork. The house sat at the end of a gravel road, surrounded by pine trees and the accumulated projects of a man who never threw anything away, because you never know when you might need it. The garage was separate from the house, a metal building that Oswald had insulated himself, wired himself, and, knowing him, probably blessed himself under some obscure metallurgical deity. Smoke curled from a chimney pipe on the roof. He was already working. Sia got out of the car and immediately felt the tension in her shoulders ease. This was the smell of home, wood smoke, hot metal, and the faint chemical tang of quenching oil. Not sterile laboratories or orbital stations with recycled air, just honest work, and the satisfying clang of hammer on steel. She pushed open the garage door. Oswald stood at his forge, a coal fire glowing orange in the brick hearth he'd built from a tutorial video and sheer stubbornness. He was 73, broad-shouldered despite his age, with a gray beard that would have made a wizard jealous, and hands that looked like they'd been carved from the same steel he worked. He wore a leather apron covered in burn marks, and what Sia strongly suspected was his late wife's name stitched into the shoulder. He didn't look up when she entered, just kept working the bellows, pumping air into the coals until they roared like a tiny dragon. "You're early," he said, his voice rough from decades of shouting over machinery and steel mills. "I'm in trouble," Sia replied. "Those two things related?" "Very much so." Oswald finally looked up, his eyes, still sharp despite cataracts the doctor kept nagging him about, taking in her expression. He grunted, set down his hammer, and gestured to a pair of folding chairs near his workbench. "Coffee's on. Pour me one, too." 5 minutes later, sitting in chairs that had seen better decades, Sia explained the situation. The summit, the shrimp, the big alien forge master with 4 arms and an ego problem. The challenge she'd accepted because her mouth worked faster than her brain. Oswald listened without interrupting, sipping coffee from a mug that read, "I turn coffee into steel," in faded letters. When she finished, he was quiet for a long moment, staring at the forge coals. "So, you need a Damascus blade," he said finally. "I need a Damascus blade that can beat alien space metal forged at 6,000 degrees by a civilization that's been doing this for 3,000 years. No pressure." Oswald stood, walked to a shelf lined with knives in various stages of completion, and selected one. He handed it to Sia. The blade was beautiful. Layers of steel, folded and forge-welded, created patterns like flowing water, frozen in metal. The edge caught the light, sharp enough to split shadows. The handle was simple wood, worn smooth from use. "Made that last month," Oswald said. "Was going to give it to Jim for his retirement. He can wait." Sia turned the knife over in her hands. "Uncle Oswald, this is gorgeous, but you don't think it's good enough?" He said it matter-of-factly, not offended. "You're thinking these aliens have fancy tech, computer-controlled forges, all that. And here's old Oswald with his coal fire, and eyeball measurements. I didn't say, "Don't have to. You're thinking it loud enough." He took the knife back, held it up to the light. "You know what this is, though?" "Really?" Sia waited. "It's 300 layers of high-carbon and low-carbon steel, folded 6 times. Every fold doubles the layers. Started with 2 pieces, ended with 300. Each layer is thinner than paper. The carbon migrates during heating, finds its own equilibrium, makes the blade flexible where it needs to be, hard where it needs to cut." He set the knife on the workbench with a solid thunk. "Your aliens optimize everything, right? Control every variable, measure everything to .0 whatever. That's fine. That's good science. But Damascus, this doesn't work that way. The steel tells you what it wants to be. You listen, you adapt. You work with it instead of forcing it. That's not worse. It's different." Sia picked up the knife again, really looking at it this time. The patterns weren't just decorative. They were a map of the forging process. Every fold, every heating cycle, every decision Oswald made while working the metal. It was art and engineering having a conversation in steel. "I need to take samples," she said. "Run tests, understand the microstructure." "Go ahead, but we're making a new one. Better one." "We." Oswald was already pulling on his heavy gloves. "You wanted to beat alien space metal with weekend garage work, right? Well, weekends in 3 days. We got work to do." He walked to a metal cabinet in the corner and pulled out a small wooden box. Inside, nestled in cloth, was a chunk of dark metal about the size of a fist. "Been saving this," he said. "Meteorite iron. Bought it off a rock collector 20 years ago. Been waiting for something special." Sia stared at the meteorite. "You're going to put space metal in the Damascus. Fight fire with fire. Fight space metal with space metal." He grinned, and for a moment looked decades younger. "Plus, it'll annoy your alien friend when he finds out. I like annoying, pompous people. He's 8 feet tall with 4 arms. Don't care. Pompous is pompous." Oswald turned back to his forge, checking the coal bed. "Now stop standing there looking worried, and fire up those fancy computers of yours. You science it, I'll smith it, and we'll see what happens when old Earth steel meets alien arrogance." Sia found herself smiling, despite everything. Maybe this was insane. Maybe she'd just guaranteed her professional humiliation in front of the entire galaxy. But she was standing in her uncle's garage, about to forge a blade the old way, the really old way. And if she was going down, at least it would be spectacular. "All right," she said, pulling out her analysis equipment. "Let's make some impossible steel." Oswald nodded, already selecting bars of metal from his stock. Outside, pine trees swayed in the Oregon wind, completely unconcerned with galactic challenges or alien forge masters. Inside the garage, the forge roared to life, and the real work began. The knife took 3 weekends and approximately 15 minor existential crises. Sia had expected the forging process to be straightforward. She'd watched Oswald work before, had even helped him a few times during college breaks. But understanding something intellectually and actually doing it, while the fate of humanity's metallurgical reputation hung in the balance, were 2 very different experiences. The first weekend was all preparation. Oswald selected his steel with the kind of care usually reserved for choosing diamonds or adoptable puppies. High-carbon steel for the hard layers, providing edge retention and strength. Low-carbon steel for the soft layers, giving flexibility and shock resistance. And then, carefully measured and included, fragments of the meteorite iron. "Nickel content's high in this stuff," Oswald explained, examining the meteorite under a magnifying glass. Maybe 8, 10%. That'll add toughness. But more important, it'll make the pattern really stand out when we etch it. Sia ran the meteorite through her portable spectrometer, watching readouts dance across her tablet screen. There's also traces of cobalt and phosphorus. That might affect the grain structure during cooling. Might, Oswald agreed. Won't know till we try. And that, Sia was learning, was the fundamental difference between how she'd been taught metallurgy and how Oswald practiced it. Her professors spoke in certainties, in controlled variables and reproducible results. Oswald spoke in maybes and will sees, trusting decades of experience and a kind of intuitive understanding that no textbook could teach. They started with the stack, layers of different steel carefully cleaned, arranged, and tack-welded together. Oswald added the meteorite fragments between layers, distributing them throughout the billet. Then came the flux, a borax compound that would prevent oxidation during heating. The trick, Oswald said, sliding the stack into the forge, is getting it hot enough to weld, but not so hot you burn it. Too cold, the layers don't bond. Too hot, you lose carbon, and the steel goes soft. What temperature are we aiming for? Oswald squinted at the glowing coals. Orange-yellow, maybe a bit of white at the edges. Sia checked her infrared thermometer. That's approximately 2,300 degrees Fahrenheit. If you say so, I call it orange-yellow. The billet heated slowly, taking on a glow that seemed to come from within the metal itself. When Oswald judged it ready, through some mysterious process that apparently involved staring really hard and occasionally poking it with a rod, he pulled it out with tongs and moved to his anvil. The hammer came down. Clang! It was, Sia thought, the most purposeful sound she'd ever heard. Not the sterile hum of laboratory equipment or the whoosh of industrial machinery. Just steel striking steel. The same sound that had echoed through human history for thousands of years. Oswald worked the billet, flattening it, checking for cold spots, returning it to the forge when needed. The pattern was hypnotic. Heat, hammer, examine, repeat. Sparks flew with each strike, tiny stars dying in the air. You're welding the layers together through force and heat, Sia said, recording video on her tablet. The boundaries between layers are becoming metallurgical bonds. I'm making them into one piece that remembers being many pieces, Oswald corrected. There's a difference. When the billet was roughly twice its original length, Oswald cut it in half with a cutting wheel, stacked the pieces, and started over. Heat, hammer, weld. Then fold again. And again. 6 folds total, each one doubling the layer count. 2 became 4, became 8, became 16, became 32, became 64, became, finally, 128 distinct layers, each one thinner than paper, all bonded into a single piece of steel that contained multitudes. By the end of the first weekend, they had the billet. Sia's instruments showed something remarkable. The carbon was migrating between layers, finding an equilibrium that her professors would have said was impossible without computer-controlled heating cycles. The meteorite fragments had distributed throughout the matrix, creating tiny nodes of high-nickel steel that would act as stress distributors. It's self-organizing, she whispered, staring at the microscope readout. The structure is optimizing itself. Oswald, cleaning his tools, just grunted. Steel's smart. You just got to let it think. The second weekend was shaping. Oswald heated the billet and began forging the blade profile. The long, gradual taper from spine to edge. The distal taper that would make the blade nimble despite its strength. Every hammer blow was placed with deliberate care, spreading the metal, thinning it, coaxing it into the shape that existed in Oswald's mind. Sia monitored the process with her equipment, watching temperature gradients, measuring thickness with digital calipers, creating what amounted to a complete scientific record of something that was supposed to be art. "You're overthinking it," Oswald said during a water break, wiping sweat from his forehead. "I'm documenting it. When Real Moth asks how we achieved the properties, I need to be able to explain. You tell him we hit hot steel with a hammer until it looked right. That's not going to satisfy a forge master from a species with 3,000 years of metallurgical tradition. Then he's asking the wrong questions." Oswald took a long drink of water. "Science is about explaining what happened. Craft is about making it happen. You can document all you want, but that won't teach someone how to do it. That takes time, mistakes, and burned fingers." By the end of weekend 2, the blade had a shape. It was rough, the surface was scaled from repeated heating, but the fundamental form was there, elegant, purposeful, dangerous. The third weekend was refinement and heat treatment, and this was where Sia really started to understand what Oswald meant about listening to the steel. The grinding took hours. Oswald worked through progressively finer belts on his grinder, removing scale, refining the bevels, bringing the blade closer and closer to its final form. The pattern began to emerge as he worked, swirling, organic shapes that looked like wood grain or water or smoke, depending on how the light hit it. "Damascus patterns are like fingerprints," Oswald explained, pausing to check his work. "No two exactly alike. That's the layers. You're seeing the boundaries between high-carbon and low-carbon steel, plus those meteorite bits. Each fold, each heating cycle, it all shows up in the pattern." Sia ran her fingers along the blade, careful to avoid the edge Oswald was developing. The patterns weren't just beautiful. They were information, a complete history of the forging process encoded in the steel itself. Then came the heat treatment, and this was where Oswald's experience really mattered. "Hardening is chemistry," he said, bringing the blade up to critical temperature. That orange-yellow color again, which Sia's thermometer measured at around 1,500 degrees. The carbon in the steel dissolves into the iron matrix when it's hot. When you quench it fast, the carbon gets trapped, makes the steel hard. But too hard is brittle, so then you temper it, heat it back up a little, let some of that tension out. He plunged the glowing blade into a tank of oil. The sound was like the world taking a sharp breath, a hiss and crackle as metal hit liquid. Steam boiled up in clouds, the oil's surface danced and writhed, and inside that violent transformation, the blade's crystal structure was being locked into a new configuration, carbon atoms trapped in a matrix that gave the steel its hardness. Oswald pulled the blade out, examined it for cracks or warps, there were none, and nodded with satisfaction. "Good. Now we temper." He cleaned the blade and placed it in a toaster. Oven he'd modified for this exact purpose. 400 degrees for 2 hours, bringing the hardness down from shatters if you look at it wrong, to will actually function as a knife. While they waited, Sia ran her final tests on samples she'd cut from practice pieces. The results were frankly absurd. The blade should have had trade-offs. Hard steel was brittle. Flexible steel couldn't hold an edge. But the layered structure of Damascus somehow gave it both properties. The hard layers provided edge retention, the soft layers absorbed shock, and the boundaries between them acted as crack arresters, preventing fractures from propagating through the blade. "It's a composite material," she said, studying the electron microscope images. "Like modern aerospace alloys, but it was developed by swordsmiths in the medieval period through pure trial and error. "Sometimes the old ways work," Oswald said, watching his toaster oven timer count down. After tempering came the final finishing, sanding to a high polish, etching with ferric chloride to darken the high carbon layers and make the pattern really pop, sharpening to an edge that would, as Oswald put it, split falling leaves. The handle was simple. Local walnut wood, shaped to fit the hand, secured with brass pins. Nothing fancy, nothing that would distract from the blade itself. When it was done, Oswald held it up to the workshop light. The blade seemed to glow from within, the Damascus pattern swirling like frozen smoke. The meteorite fragments created subtle breaks in the pattern, little starbursts of brightness against the darker steel. The edge caught the light and seemed to disappear, sharp enough that photons themselves couldn't decide if they'd hit something. "Well," Oswald said after a long moment, "that'll do." Sia laughed despite herself. 3 weekends of work, thousands of hammer blows, the combined metallurgical knowledge of ancient technique and modern science, and the final assessment was, "That'll do." "I need to run one more round of tests," she said. "Strength, flexibility, edge retention, thermal properties. Rilmoth is going to examine this thing down to the molecular level." "He can examine all he wants. Steel doesn't lie." Oswald handed her the blade. "You take it. Run your tests. But remember, this isn't about proving we're better than the Draymore. It's about showing them there's more than one way to make good steel." Sia took the blade carefully, feeling the weight of it, the balance. It felt alive in her hand, purposeful, like it knew what it was for. "What if it's not enough?" she asked quietly. "What if I get up there and Rilmoth tears it apart, proves it's inferior?" Oswald was already starting to clean his workshop, putting tools back in their places. "Then we learned something. That's not failure. That's science. But between you and me?" He paused, looked at the blade in her hand. "I've been forging steel for 50 years. Made thousands of blades. That one, right there? That's the best thing I've ever made. So if it's not enough, nothing I could do would be." That should have been terrifying. Instead, Sia found it oddly comforting. They'd done their best, used old techniques and new understanding, human intuition and meteorite iron from space itself. If that wasn't enough to impress an alien forge master, well, at least they'd gone down swinging. She wrapped the blade carefully in cloth, packed it in a cushioned case, and prepared for the journey back to Helix Prime. In 3 days, the whole galaxy would find out if weekend garage metallurgy could stand against 3,000 years of tradition. Sia was terrified. She was also, despite everything, excited. Time to show Rilmoth what humanity could do when properly motivated by public humiliation and family pride. Helix Prime had transformed during her absence. The observation deck where Sia had accidentally ignited this whole mess now looked like a gladiatorial arena designed by someone with too much budget and not enough restraint. Holographic displays floated in the air, ready to broadcast the test results to every corner of the station. Seating had been arranged in a semicircle around a central platform, and every seat was occupied. Word had spread through the galactic community faster than light speed. The upstart human was returning to face Draymore judgment. Sia clutched her carrying case and tried not to throw up. Rilmoth stood at the center of the platform, all 4 arms crossed in a pose that screamed, "I've already won." His singing steel blade rested on a display stand beside him, its surface catching light in ways that made Sia's eyes hurt. Around him, a panel of judges from a dozen species examined equipment and murmured in their various languages. The jellyfish delegate from last time pulsed a sympathetic greeting as Sia passed. She nodded back, grateful for any friendliness, in what felt very much like walking into a den of very polite lions. "Ah," Rilmoth's voice boomed across the platform. "The human returns. I confess, I wondered if you might simply flee, rather than face inevitable disappointment." "Traffic was bad," Sia replied, climbing onto the platform. Her hands were sweating. "Orbital insertion windows are always a pain." A ripple of what might have been laughter passed through the crowd. Rilmoth's mandibles clicked in what she chose to interpret as amusement rather than anticipation of her imminent humiliation. "You have brought your blade?" he asked. Sia opened her case. The Damascus knife lay nestled in foam, its pattern swirling under the station's lights. She heard a few sharp intakes of breath from the audience. The blade was, objectively, beautiful. Rilmoth leaned forward, his four eyes examining the knife with professional interest. One hand reached out, paused, asking permission, silently. Sia handed it over. The forge master turned the blade slowly, his eyes tracking the pattern, the way light played across the surface. His expression was unreadable, which, given that she had no idea how to read Draymore expressions anyway, wasn't saying much. "Pattern welding," he said finally. "Ancient technique. Functional, but crude compared to molecular-level fabrication." "My uncle would probably agree with you," Sia said. "He'd also say crude doesn't mean ineffective." "We shall see." Rilmoth handed the blade to a judge, a crystalline being that refracted light in disorienting ways, who placed it on a second display stand. "The tests are simple: edge retention, flexibility, thermal resistance. 3 trials. Your blade must match or exceed singing steel's performance in at least 2 categories to avoid. Well, not failure. We are civilized. Let us call it learning opportunity." "How generous?" "I thought so." The first test began immediately. Edge retention. Both blades would cut through progressively harder materials until they either dulled or failed catastrophically. The singing steel went first. Rilmoth himself operated the testing rig, feeding materials through with the confidence of someone who'd done this 1,000 times. Synthetic polymers, hardened ceramics, composite armors. The blade sang, literally sang, a high-pitched tone that made Sia's teeth ache as it sliced through everything presented to it. The molecular vibrations did exactly what Rilmoth had promised, allowing the blade to cut materials far harder than itself. Impressive. Undeniably impressive. Then came the Damascus blade's turn. Sia held her breath as the same materials were fed through. The blade didn't sing. It just cut, the edge biting into material after material, with what looked like contempt for the entire concept of hardness. The meteorite fragments in the steel matrix caught the light with each pass, little stars embedded in flowing patterns. When the test concluded, the judges conferred. The crystalline being announced the results in a voice like wind chimes. Edge retention, equivalent performance. Both blades maintained cutting ability through all materials. No significant dulling detected. The crowd murmured. Rilmoth's expression shifted slightly. Surprise, maybe? Or was she projecting? "Acceptable," the forge master said. "But edge retention alone does not make a superior blade. Let us proceed to flexibility." This test was simpler but more brutal. Both blades would be bent progressively until they either returned to true or snapped. Singing steel, Rilmoth had explained during his original presentation, was rigid by design, meant for powerful strikes rather than finesse. His blade went into the testing vise. The judges activated it, bending the blade slowly. At 15 degrees, Rilmoth signaled to stop. The blade returned to straight. No permanent deformation. "Singing steel is not designed for extreme flexibility," he said. "It serves its purpose through precision and power." Fair enough. Sia watched as the Damascus blade was mounted. The vise engaged. 15 degrees. The blade bent and returned to true. No problem. 30 degrees, still fine. The layered structure distributing the stress. 45 degrees. 50. 60. The crowd had gone completely silent. At 70 degrees, Sia was certain the blade would snap. She could see the curve, almost a right angle, and her engineering training was screaming that no steel should do this without permanent deformation. The judges released the pressure. The blade sprang back to straight, quivering slightly from the stored energy. The patterns along its surface seemed to flow like water, each layer sliding microscopically against its neighbors, distributing stress in ways that no single piece of steel ever could. "Impossible," Rilmoth said quietly. Then, louder, "I demand to examine this blade's composition." The crystalline judge produced a molecular scanner, running it along the Damascus blade's length. Readouts appeared in holographic display: iron, carbon, trace elements. The meteorite fragments showed up as small, bright spots of nickel and cobalt. "There is no exotic matter," the judge announced. "No molecular-level modification beyond what occurs naturally during forging. This is, by all measurements, simple steel." "Simple steel does not perform this way," Rilmoth insisted. "And yet," Sia said, finding her voice, "here we are." The Forge Master's 4 eyes locked onto her. For a moment, she thought she'd pushed too far. Then something in his posture shifted. Not defeat, but reassessment. "The final test," he said. "Thermal resistance." This was where Sia expected everything to fall apart. Thermal shock, rapid heating and cooling, was brutal on any metal. The crystalline structure expanded and contracted, creating internal stresses that could shatter even the finest steel. Rilmoth's singing steel was designed for space combat, where temperature swings from sunlight to shadow could span hundreds of degrees. Both blades were heated to glowing orange, then plunged into coolant. Back to heat. Back to cold. Again. Again. On the third cycle, Rilmoth's singing steel cracked. Just a hairline fracture, barely visible, but the sensors caught it immediately. The molecular resonance that gave the blade its cutting power had become a vulnerability. The vibrations themselves had created weak points in the crystal structure. The Damascus blade came out of its 5th cycle unmarked. How? Rilmoth wasn't asking the judges. He was asking Sia directly. The thermal expansion should tear your layers apart. The carbon distribution is irregular. That should create failure points. Sia stepped forward, surprised to find her hands had stopped shaking. That's the thing. The irregularity is the strength. The layers expand at slightly different rates, but instead of fighting each other, they slide microscopically. The boundaries act as stress relief. And the carbon migration during forging, it created a gradient, not a uniform distribution. So, different parts of the blade respond differently to temperature, but it all averages out. You designed this? No. My uncle made it the way his grandfather taught him, who learned from his grandfather. Nobody designed it. It evolved through hundreds of years of trial and error. We didn't optimize for any single property. We optimized for good enough at everything. And somehow that made it excellent at surviving the real world. Rilmoth lifted the Damascus blade again, examining it with what Sia now recognized as professional hunger, the look of a craftsman seeing something new and beautiful. Your uncle, he said slowly. In his garage, on weekends. He creates this level of work as recreation. His words were something to do while listening to old rock music. Yeah, the Forge Master made that grinding rocks sound again. This time, Sia understood. It wasn't mockery. It was laughter, genuine and surprised. I have spent 80 years, your years, perfecting my technique. I have access to forges that can create temperatures found in stellar cores. I have computational systems that can model crystalline structures down to individual atoms. He held up the Damascus blade. And I was bested by casual weekend hobby work. To be fair, Sia said, it was 3 weekends. The crowd erupted in what she hoped was laughter, and not the prelude to her being ejected from an airlock. Rilmoth set the blade down carefully. Then, with deliberate ceremony, he performed a gesture with all 4 arms, crossing them over his chest and bowing his head, that made several Draymore in the audience gasp. "You have won this challenge," he announced. "I acknowledge the skill of your Uncle Oswald, and I would very much like to meet him." Sia blinked. "You want to meet my uncle?" "I wish to learn. We Draymore have pursued perfection until we became rigid, like my singing steel. Beautiful, powerful, but brittle when stressed in unexpected ways. Your people retain chaos, the willingness to try inefficient methods that somehow produce extraordinary results. This is valuable. This is—" he paused, searching for words, "wisdom that comes from still being willing to fail." 3 months later, Oswald's garage in Millbrook, Oregon hosted its first alien visitor. Rilmoth had to duck to fit through the door, and his 4 arms made the already cluttered space feel positively crowded. But he stood at the forge like a student before a master, watching as Oswald demonstrated the ancient art of eyeballing temperatures and calling measurements about that much. "You do not measure the heat?" Rilmoth asked, fascinated. "Thermometer's over there if you want it," Oswald replied, gesturing vaguely. "But the steel tells you when it's ready. You just gotta listen." "How does one listen to steel?" "That's what you're here to learn." Sia watched from her folding chair, sipping coffee and trying not to laugh at the sight of an 8-foot alien forge master learning to pump a coal forge. Bellows. The Damascus techniques were spreading across the galaxy now, other species combining their precision with human improvisational chaos, creating hybrids that neither approach could achieve alone. She'd received letters from craftsmen on 16 different worlds. Most thanked her. Some complained that their nice, predictable metallurgy was now contaminated with inefficient human randomness. She considered those ones compliments. Her favorite, though, was from a young Draymore apprentice who'd written, "Forge Master Rilmoth says the greatest shame is learning to do one thing perfectly and refusing to learn anything else. Thank you for teaching us. We can still be students." "So," Oswald said, pulling a glowing billet from the forge, "you ready to make your first Damascus blade?" Rilmoth's 4 arms positioned themselves nervously over hammer and tongs. "I believe so. Though I must warn you, my precision might be a handicap here." "Oh, you'll be terrible at first," Oswald said cheerfully. "Everyone is. That's the point." The hammer came down, clang, and somewhere in that sound was the future. A galaxy learning that perfection and chaos could coexist, that the old ways and new ways weren't opposites but partners, and that sometimes the best solutions came from people willing to try stupid things in their garage on weekends. Sia raised her coffee mug in a private toast. To Damascus steel, to stubborn uncles, and to the beautiful disasters that happen when you let humans loose on metallurgy. The forge roared, the hammer sang, and the galaxy learned something new.